Welcome to the Bookshop at the End of the Internet, a podcast dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Just like your favorite neighborhood bookshop, this show is a place to explore, find hidden gems, and meet new writers from every corner of the publishing world. Feel free to browse around and discover a new favorite book at the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. I'm your host, Stacey Horan, author, book lover, and your guide to great conversations with some amazing writers. This is episode number 275. If you enjoy the show, please take a moment to leave a review, follow along on social media, and share the podcast with fellow readers. Before we dive in, a quick update from my own writing desk. I am currently hard at work on editing my manuscript for a new standalone thriller. Of course, my books, including the Old City Mystery Series, are always available wherever you enjoy shopping for books. Thanks for supporting both the show and my stories. Happy reading. On today's episode of The Bookshop at the End of the Internet, I'm joined by author Carlyn Greenwald to discuss her latest novel, What Happened to Those Girls? This harrowing YA thriller is packed with secrets, betrayals, and a killer lurking in the woods. Emma has always been the black sheep of her friend group, so when her so-called friends leave for a camping trip without her, she's hurt, especially since she was the one who planned the trip. But she's not entirely surprised. What she doesn't expect is to wake up the next morning and learn that every one of them was found dead at the campsite. Did Emma survive simply because she was left behind? Or is there something more sinister at play? As the police begin their investigation and suspicions start to swirl, Emma finds herself in a race against the clock to uncover who murdered the girls and why, before she becomes the prime suspect. In this episode, Carlyn and I discuss her writing journey, the influence that films like The Blair Witch Project had on the novel, and why even the darkest YA stories need to leave room for hope. All that and more coming up next. Carlyn Greenwald, thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
I thought what we could do today is start by talking about your brand new book, What Happened to Those Girls? If you don't mind, tell us a little bit about this book and what inspired you to write it.
Yeah, so What Happened to Those Girls is a YA thriller horror. It is about the black sheep of a friend group who puts together this camping trip only for her friends to go on the trip without her, and then they all die under mysterious circumstances. So she teams up with the older sister of one of the victims to go back and sort of see what actually happened to her friends. And it was actually inspired by, I was randomly listening to this podcast a few years ago talking about the Blair Witch Project and the idea of like complicated dynamics within like a survival situation. And I thought that was really interesting, but then it got me thinking of like in friend groups, they're so much more complicated than just like one trip. And what would have happened if these, almost like a slasher film happened to some of the friends, but there's still a friend who had a complex dynamic with them and like wasn't invited, and what would that do to someone who survived a slasher because they weren't invited, like in just sort of talking about survivor's guilt and stuff like that. But yeah, that's pretty much how it came to be. And then my publisher picked that one when we were talking about book 2, and here we are.
And we should mention book 1 was Murderland.
Yes,
we'll talk about that in a little bit, but I want to go back to what happened to those girls. And in particular, I'd like to talk about Emma. Mm-hmm. When people meet her in the book, what would be helpful for them to know? Because I'm curious how she came about as a character, like how you decided on Emma as she is for your survivor of this.
Yeah. So with Emma, I trying to think of where it came from. I wanted to talk about sort of outcasts within friend groups, but I didn't want it to be like she's not like other girls kind of trope where it was just like, oh, she is like a manic pixie dream girl and all her friends are basic. And I myself was coming to terms with being neurodivergent, I think autistic, and I was just like, I've never seen a character have the kind of neurodivergence that I have, which was like, it's a lot based around sort of social awkwardness and then these hyperfixations that I get on celebrities. And I was like, it'd be really interesting if sort of the issue, like not issue, but like thing that divides Emma from her friends is that she is neurodivergent and is young and doesn't really know like how to navigate it yet, and her friends are also young and don't know how to navigate it either. And so it's sort of this on the surface difference of interests where, Emma's really into horror movies and like has these hyperfixations, and her friends are, into other things that are kind of adjacent, but not at the level of intensity as she feels them. And I just thought that'd be an interesting way to go into the story. So again, it's like the idea of I never wanted Emma to be like a negative sort of or like misogynistic stereotype of like, an outcast girl. So I think that's sort of how the neurodivergence came into play. And then, of course, like the character who knows horror in a sort of horror thriller is in itself a trope, sort of, I feel like Scream kind of started that with Randy. And so it'd be fun, like to have a character who's kind of aware of what's going, like a little bit, but also it's so unfathomable that you are actually in something where something extreme, like a murderer stalking you, is actually happening. So, yeah.
I'm curious why you decided that this story should be YA, because it could have been adult. You could have aged up the characters. You could have made it a bunch of moms that go on a mom trip, or it could have been any number of different scenarios. But what was it about making it for a YA audience? I'm sure adults are reading it too, but what was it about characters in that age group that appealed to you for this particular story?
I think that teenage girlhood is just a really sort of cruel time. I think that it's and it like to all the credit to even like, quote unquote mean girls at that age, I think that it's just a time when you are so focused on peer approval, whether you understand why that is so important or not. And so I just thought like that is the age where I think, I remember hearing about the term like the friend that no one likes in like an adult context of like adult friendships, but I feel like that starts at, around high school, around middle school, where, there's one person who's just a little more awkward than you, and and like, I think it's a natural human instinct if you're not catching yourself of being like, for my own social survival, I will side with the people who look down upon the sort of quote unquote weaker link. And I think that, teenage brains just aren't developed enough to see that that's, really, really cruel, bad behavior and what that does. And so, yeah, I was just like, this is a teenage girl. I feel like it'd be most intense in teenhood to
Yeah.
have this friendship dynamic. And it's really the like onus of the story is this friendship dynamic. So it felt right.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I imagine also the severity of what is happening in some ways for a teenager is, I mean, as an adult hearing about it, it's so horrific. I'm sure for a teenager it's horrific. It's also a bit like you're just a bit less able to process perhaps the severity of it, which probably as a writer gives you freedom for your
Hmm.
characters to do a lot of different things that perhaps maybe someone a bit older, wiser, more experienced might not.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, that's always the thing with YA thrillers where I feel like it's so difficult to write a YA thriller because you have to suspend disbelief that like how on earth are the parents not getting involved in when they're like dead teens and these teenagers have to make these really objectively terrible decisions like to even have a story. So I feel like yeah, you kind of need them to be teens in order to write a lot of these thrillers where you're like, okay, I need you to suspend disbelief because teenagers make bad decisions. Like you're gonna have to roll with me here, and you're not wrong. Like and then of course the the objective for the storyteller is to make you believe that you understand why they make these decisions through like their emotional their emotional worlds and like their motivation, internal motivation and stuff like that.
Yeah. Are there things that you need to keep foremost in your mind when you're writing a story like this for a YA audience? Are there obstacles you need to overcome, or perhaps things you need to avoid, or places you need to tread carefully when you're writing this story? Are those things that you think about as you're writing, or is it a case of write what you want to write, go back, and then smooth or dial back or whatever after the fact?
Yeah, it's definitely both. So
Mm.
I think the only thing I think of before I start the story and like while writing is like you tend to want to have YA stories, even when they are horror thriller, to have some amount of hope. That's one of the things that like you'll often hear distinguishes adult from YA is again, because your readers, your intended audience is young and still developing, there's some extent where you just don't want to leave them in total despair. Obviously, you can do that. I think it has to be way more justified. In this case, with this story, that wasn't the thing I needed to do. So it was like, what's the hope going to be at the end of the book? That will go through my entire outline. And then from there, while writing it, I think the only thing, I mean, like, first of all, I am definitely like pro making sure that like you're not dumbing anything down for teenagers. I think that they are, very thoughtful, very smart, like very underestimated, and like they can handle a lot. I always want to respect that within the story. And I think that then the line becomes, and I usually will just sort of write the story. In this case, the story was actually a lot more violent than Murderland, my previous YA. So I kind of just wrote what I wanted at that point. I think that, you know, when I was first writing it, it's a lot of, thinking about other horror movies that have teenagers. And obviously, within the film world, that's not really written for a YA audience. It's just teens in these movies intended for, general audiences, which I guess can be mostly adults historically. And then what I did afterwards was I went through and I was like, okay, I don't want this to be kind of torture porny because you are dealing with young people in the same way that you don't want like sex scenes. Like you could have on the page sex for teens, but you don't want it to be tittillating. I feel like that applies for violence too, of like, okay, if it's going to be on the page, why is it on the page? And what is the focus going to be? And I wanted to, so I basically took the violence that was shown and I culled it back to where it's more about the emotion of, death and killing versus like getting really gritty with literally what is happening. Like there's not blow by blow murder scenes that I might have put in an adult book. And so
Right.
that's sort of where I put that line there. And will that be true for other YAs? Like, I don't know. It'll really depend on the story, but that was something I wanted to be careful of with this book in particular.
Right. Is this the kind of book you would have wanted to read when you were the age of the reader you're writing for? I mean, were you drawn to these sort of thriller horror kinds of stories? Are you still drawn to
Yeah.
these?
Yeah, I was a teenager in like the late yeah, I guess it was like early 2010s. So like during that YA boom after Twilight and like it was a time when there was all the dystopians and the paranormal romances and I read Twilight, I read The Hunger Games and I didn't really I was like okay, like these are great. I don't want to read more of them. So I was drawn to, yeah, like there were a lot of really weird, creative, horror thriller books at that time. Like I remember books like I Hunt Killers by Barry Lyga. I have like a bookshelf right now. I'm trying to look at it. Like the Unwind series by Neil Shusterman. Like there are these very strange, creative ideas that were all about like murder and that was what I read for a lot of, when I was a teen and then into adulthood. Yeah, I still right now I'm focused on reading adult horror because I'm trying to fill in the gaps of like I had a really strong YA horror thriller background and now I'm like, okay, what's going on the other side? So reading a lot, but yeah, it's still I tend to anytime I want a book that I don't want to say is easy, but is easy on my brain. I will go to horror thriller because the pacing keeps me engaged in a way that like I have to turn on and use a slightly different muscle reading any other genre, because fantasy, the books tend to be longer and denser with romance. The plot is a little bit less external usually, so Yeah, horror thrillers are like my go-to still.
Well, let's talk about a few of your other books, if that's all
Yeah.
right. So,
Hmm.
Murderland, was that your first foray into this sort of teen horror?
No. Oh my
No.
gosh.
Okay.
I have been writing like thriller, mystery, horror stuff. I mean, not really horror, mystery thriller, I guess, since I was 13. So I have like a backlog of dozens, like literally dozens of books that never went anywhere because, I was young, they're not that good. Maybe I can like repurpose some ideas, but no. And then actually, I got my first agent with a different YA thriller that has not seen the light of day yet in like 2018. That one died on sub. There was like another YA thriller that died on sub in like 2020. No, Murderland is probably like the 20 something like thriller that I wrote. So I have a lot of experience behind it, but I feel like I have been learning so much like exponentially once I got published and have like my editor's feedback and what I've learned through that time. But yeah, so in a way, I still consider it kind of my first again because of this like it's so different to write without an agent, without publishers, and then the other side of that. So kind
Right.
of and kind of not.
So you're one of those stories where you're recently discovered, newly found talent that's been at it for years and
Yeah,
years.
absolutely. I feel like I went through like two versions of that. There was one where I was just like writing, 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 and then it took a long time to get my agent, took a long time to get a book deal. So, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about Murderland. For anybody
Mhm.
who hasn't read it, can you tell us again a little bit about that book and in particular, like what was the spark for that one?
Yeah, okay. I've done this one in a while. Okay, so it's about a teenage ride operator on a preview night for new land in kind of a Disneyland-esque park. And she oh my God, let me think. Yeah, so she one of her coworkers rides the ride she's operating and dies, and so she thinks she's going to be blamed for this. So she basically spends one night at the park in this sort of limited capacity preview night trying to find out what actually happened to this man, and she uncovers like theme park conspiracies along the way. And the spark for this one was I was a really big fan of true crime and theme parks, and there's a weird intersection of true crime theme park stories that actually happened in like Disney World and stuff like that. And I just thought that would be so fun to use as like a setting slash plot. And then a friend of mine was like, I had this idea I'm never gonna write of like a girl solving her best friend's murder at a theme park, and I was like, oh, I had a like I combined that with a different idea, and then Murderland was born.
I take it that writing for young adults and writing in this sort of thriller horror genre
Hmm.
is kind of a sweet spot for you.
Yeah.
Is that fair? So, are there more? Is your plan to continue writing? Because you don't just write in this genre,
Yeah.
right? So, or you haven't just written in this genre. Is the plan to continue writing either for this audience or in this genre or both?
Yeah, so absolutely want to continue writing YA horror thriller. I'm in a line called Midnight Reads with Sourcebooks Fire, and they have been amazing. I would love to continue to work with them, continue to be a face in the line of these wonderful paperback original titles that again, it's so nice to be more accessible to teenagers in that format and like with these stories that I think they do are really drawn to. That's a wonderful thing. I'm really drawn to them. I also recently announced my first adult thriller called Killing Time. And so that one will be out summer 2027. Really excited about that one. It's kind of, what do we call it? My Sister the Serial Killer meets Back to the Future. So it has like a time travel element, and that one's gnarly. Like that's one where I did not hold back because it's for adults. And that was it was just a wonder. I love that book and I'm very excited to keep doing that. That one's in like line edits right now. And then otherwise, I mean, in terms of like the romance, and I've written two romances, Sizzle Reel and Director's Cut. That's actually the first books I got published. Just funny enough, that's how life turned out. I don't know if I'll ever write in them again. I'm open to it, if the idea ever comes, but for right now, I would say I'm satisfied with being in the sort of horror thriller space in YA and adult. So
Mm.
we'll see. Open to it, but this is great. What I have going on right now. Very
Yeah.
grateful for it.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting what you just said about your adult thriller coming
Hmm.
out. Because I would think writing for adults
Hmm.
is more, you have more freedom
Yeah.
in certain aspects. Maybe fewer things you need to consider
Yeah.
when you're writing it, violence or language or whatever.
Yeah.
So for you, when you compare them,
Hmm.
I imagine they both satisfy certain needs that you might have as a writer, sort of
Yeah.
creative needs. Can you sort of compare and contrast them a bit for us? Like what you find satisfying about writing for YA versus what you find satisfying writing for adults?
Yeah, I mean, okay, let's see. So the first thing that comes to mind is adults allows you to tell a wider range of stories because suddenly people can have jobs and they can have expertise. And that has been so appealing to me. Like I write characters that for the most part are in their 20s and 30s, so they're still like relatively young adults, but it just opens up the world to, they can draw from, an extra 10 plus years of experience compared to the YAs and it's just a lot of fun to be able to, therefore, set these thrillers in these sort of specific worlds that, and with characters who sort of have different mindsets that make more sense for adults. Someone jaded with their life, I feel like you're probably a little bit more likely to see that as an adult versus a teenager jaded with their life. And even if it is a teenager jaded with their life, it's different. It's going to be different. Um, yeah, I feel like that's the biggest thing. And then otherwise, I think I have tried to make a distinction between my YAs and adults. We'll see if it stays this way, where Killing Time is my adult book is sort of more cerebral, I guess, a little bit more like really sinking into its themes and playing not it's I wouldn't say it's fully upmarket, but it's a little bit more in that direction of trying to say something. And it's not that my YAs don't have themes, they absolutely do, but I feel like I'm more willing to go for like the silly concept that's just more pulpy and fun because I feel like somehow there's a theme that will slip in, like the theme, the like friendship dynamics within What Happened to Those Girls. It ended up being a lot more serious than I think I originally intended. That's fine. But yeah, I think that it's just sort of more, yeah, that somehow has been a little bit different. But and then otherwise, yeah, the funny thing is, while editing my adult book, I feel like I started going like, because I was a YA author, I'm like, okay, I'm gonna throw all the swearing, all the violence, all the sex into this book. And then my editor has been like, okay, like, what do we actually need? And that's been so funny where I'm like, I think at this point, if I compared a YA to an adult, like the adult book might have less swearing. I'm literally going through and like deciding if the swearing like makes sense for the story. And it's been really funny. So I think that also might just be a difference in like it's obviously two very different publishers, but yeah, it's been fun.
How about the amount of time you have to spend in your characters' heads explaining their thoughts, their feelings, their actions? Do you find there's no difference between your characters or your readers, the audience for your books, the amount of time you spend in your characters' heads, or does one require more than the other?
Ooh, I feel like I write such like first person that is very like deep in the character's head that probably isn't that different. I think the difference I have been learning writing adult is like to bring forth a certain amount of confidence that I think I inherently wasn't putting into my characters because I'm like, first of all, like I wrote YA for so long, and then I'm like, okay, you're 25, you're a baby. I felt like, a loser disaster at 25. And I think it was interesting to sort of like confront the idea that like for the adult audience, like, do you want like what would it be like if the character was a little bit more confident and fit more into like genre conventions for the adult audience in thriller that I had never thought about before? Because I remember on sub I would always get notes of like this reads YA, and I feel like my editor that who bought it like started to unravel what that was talking about. And so I kind of like the idea of learning how to distinguish the two a lot. I mean, for like branding reasons and also just like as as a student of the craft of writing, I find it very interesting. And then otherwise, I would say in terms of explanation, it's a very, very subtle thing where in YA, I feel like taking the time to have characters explain things, like in terms of like, I don't know, queer identity or neurodivergence or something like that, where I will try to be a little bit more gentle with it and a little bit more, again, I'm not trying to preach to teens. That's not the point. But there will be a little bit more care with making those ideas clear versus in adult, like they can be less, they can be more abrasive with how they are, they could be a little bit more, shall we say, problematic in how they are dealing with whatever it is they are dealing with, because the hope is that adults can see through the lines of like, you know what? Not everyone has gone to therapy and knows the correct terminology and how to process something in a positive way. So that's sort of something more that'll be in the adult work, especially in Killing Time because it's set in 1994. And I think if it had been a YA novel, I might have, sort of skirted around certain things. But in this one, to some extent, you're like, okay, they were homophobic back then. They were whatever it is. And like being more willing to touch on that a little bit more. 'Cause like, all right, audience, like, I think you can handle this.
Right, right. So now that you've got the two YAs published, Murderland
Yeah.
and What Happened to Those Girls, and you've got the adult thriller horror coming out
Hmm.
summer 2027,
Yeah.
you spent a long time, let's say, leading up to that. And now you've had this success with finding agents and publishers and getting books out into the world with their help. So I'm
Hmm.
curious, now that you are here,
Yeah.
what has surprised you about where you are, what you're experiencing, what you're at, what you're having to do, what you're being asked to do that you didn't know back before you sort of made this transition?
Ooh, that's a good question. So the first thing that comes to mind is I didn't know how much social media I would have to do, but I don't think any author anticipated that. It's just something we're all dealing with, is the amount of social media and sort of, understanding how to make something palatable in like the social media age where things keep changing and algorithms and stuff like that. But otherwise, I think I've learned a lot about craft in a way that has surprised me. Like, I tend to write, or at least I did, still kind of do, these really complicated stories of like, there's so many subplots, there's so many like red herrings and stuff like that. And I came to realize between Murderland and What Happened to Those Girls of like, simplicity can actually be a good thing. It's actually, and I think what it is learning to write for a different audience. Where I think that when I was a teen, books were, they weren't as, I'm trying to think of the right word, like easy, maybe? Like the idea that simplicity can still be satisfying for a reader is really interesting to me because I remember thinking you have to make the most complex puzzle ever. Otherwise, the readers won't enjoy it. And I've come to sort of gather from this, like as the audience have changed with, the age of, attention spans getting smaller and people focusing on a billion things while reading and stuff like that, that, the way you tell stories can change and that, maybe I only need one main plot and one subplot and one internal plot, and that's fine. And it's actually allowed me to like cull through my storytelling and make it like it leaves a lot of room for, character work and stuff that I always wanted to be there but wasn't shining through because I made my plot so complex. And it's been a really beautiful thing to realize because I think that What Happened to Those Girls and Killing Time are like some of my best works because I was able to like learn from the world around me and my editors to come back to this. And I hope to continue to use it, like to be able to be nimble on your feet and write to sort of, what you care about, but then also being aware of like, where is this book in the larger ecosystem of books?
Very, yeah, very interesting. And I agree with you. I think books are becoming less complicated as far as the puzzle goes, but deeper,
Yeah.
perhaps. So it seems a bit more simplistic, and yet when you read it, you feel like there's nothing simple here at all for the ones that for the writers that really get it right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And look, I still love a puzzle book. There's probably someone out there that's still still doing it. Again, if you like that stuff, Murderland has mystery in the past, mystery in the present, all this lore. Like I still love the book, but yeah, it's definitely I don't know if I would repeat that in the near future. I think I would continue to go down my new path of simplicity.
Good. Well, along that vein, if people want to learn more about you, learn more about the books that you have out, look for new releases when they're announced, that kind of thing, where should they go to find you and that information?
So I'm most active on Instagram. My handle is Carlyn_GEE. And then I'm also on Threads, same handle. I update that as much as I can. And those are the main ones. I have a website, carlyngreenwald.com, where I again try to update as much as I can. But Instagram is definitely the one that I am most on and is the most accurate.
Good. And if people want to purchase a copy of What Happened to Those Girls or Murderland or any of the ones that you have published, where should they go to buy them?
Well, I have a soft spot for a local indie called Romans in Los Angeles. If you are looking for an indie to purchase from, I love them. They're great. Otherwise, I I feel like you can order from wherever makes sense for your financial needs and where you are in the world. So, if you order it anywhere across the big box websites, Murderland is on it's sometimes in Target. I don't know if it is right now. And Walmart and all those sort of stores. I was very lucky to get it in there. Again, it might not be in there anymore, but otherwise, Barnes and Noble's always fine. Whatever you could do.
Good. Well, Carlyn, I want to thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast. And I want to wish you luck with What Happened to Those Girls and the new one that'll be coming out next summer. So
Yes.
congratulations on everything you've accomplished so far, and best of luck with the rest of your writing journey.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This podcast is all about helping readers discover new voices. This show brings you into conversation with authors from every corner of the writing world, and each of them has a story worth hearing. I'm your host, Stacey Horan, author of the Old City Mystery series and several standalone novels. Sharing conversations with fellow writers is one of my favorite parts of the creative life, and I'm thrilled to bring those conversations to you. Keep listening, keep exploring, and keep finding the stories that speak to you. There's always another treasure waiting here in the bookshop at the end of the internet.